The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to the Able to Care podcast. My name is Andy Baker, your host. And I thought I would talk today about a subject around words, around the use of language. Now, many of my podcast guests and episodes that I've done in the past, you've probably heard me mentioned, if you were a long-time listener, that sometimes I think language is really important because it affects the way that we perceive something, it affects the attitude towards something, and it also affects other people as well. So I thought I'd do a little episode today on one of the areas that I often teach when I'm talking about behaviour management is the use of language. And there's three phrases that I often tend to try and draw attention to when I'm looking at behaviour management. So I just thought I'd talk about those today. The first one is a term that I really dislike. I hear it all the time, and I'm sure many of you may use it in your regular vernacular as far as just a term you throw away without really thinking. And that's a term kicked off. So when I'm looking at behaviour management, I often hear people referring to such and such kicked off, and then they kicked off, and okay, you hear that all the time. I personally feel the only time the term kicked off should be used is in relation to sports. Otherwise, ideally, it shouldn't be used. I get why it is. And please don't kind of consider me to be, punctuation police or anything like that. The reason I have a problem with the term kicked off is because, like a number of different uses of language, it's a label to a behavior that doesn't really give us any specifics. So if I'm turning up on shift and somebody goes, Ben kicked off again earlier, well, does that mean that Ben got overwhelmed by what was going on and threw himself to the floor and started smacking his head on the floor? Or Ben kicked off because he couldn't cope with this change in his routine, so he went to his room and smashed it up? Or Ben kicked off because his mum cancelled contact, so he tried to break out the fire door so he could, run away to try and find her. Now, all of those might be described as by staff in a residential setting as Ben kicked off. But they're all very different behaviors with very different causes and very different triggers or outcomes, okay? I find it unhelpful. Let's be specific here. What does it actually mean? Because I think the problem with that term as well, one, it kind of immediately denotes violence when violence wouldn't necessarily occur. If I kicked off and hit you, maybe that's a different level of intensity and a different level of judgment you might have than if I kicked off because I just said I got angry. And it wasn't even directed at anybody. I was just angry at the situation. The other problem I have with this term is that, well, who does it put the fault at the feet of? It immediately puts the fault of the individual who kicked off. Now, I guarantee pretty much everybody who is listening to this or watching this, at some point in your life, you've behaved in a way that somebody else might describe as you kicked off. But it might have been a case of that's because they pissed you off. Human beings, we are amazing at attributing our behavior down to social environmental factors, but other people's behavior is down to their personality. So I often use the analogy that, well, the reason I got caught speeding is because I was on a long straight road, there was no other traffic on there, I didn't realize how fast I was going, I was late for work because that person was going really slow and I overtook them for a second, and if they don't, I'll make up excuses that certain social and environmental factors are impacting on the reason I was speeding. The reason that person got caught speeding is because they're don't care about other people on the roads and they're just trying to show off how fast their car is and da-da-da-da-da. We're very good at attributing, other people's behavior as their personalities, who they are. So another example I use is like the cutting somebody off in traffic. Like, I know at times I've accidentally cut somebody off in traffic or had to cut somebody off in traffic because I suddenly caught myself in the wrong lane. I was running out of space. I didn't realize. I thought I signaled in time. Maybe they didn't see it. Again, it'll be social environmental factors. But the reason they cut somebody off in traffic is because they're a typical such and such driver or just an arrogant so-and-so. And whether it be down to our personal feelings, our personalization of the event, or whether it be down to sometimes we have slight prejudice towards certain vehicle types or certain drivers, kind of then immediately impact on that thought process for us, as far as they're doing that on purpose, as opposed to who knows what's going on in their world and what's going on in their day and how they were feeling in that particular moment. the other main issue or major issue I have with the term kicked off is the more we understand about human behavior. I'm a big advocator as far as deterministic behavior. I don't necessarily believe in free will in the same way that many people will, and that may cause some controversy. But the more that we understand about human behavior, we recognize that much of human behavior is non-conscious. Okay, it's not a thought-out process. We can make it conscious, but it's not a thought-out process. Okay, and as you go deeper into that tunnel, the less and less seems to be conscious. Sometimes we rationalize a choice after our brain's already made it without us being aware of the choice whatsoever. The reason I draw that up, though, is our understanding of the difference with what used to be called a tantrum and now potentially being a meltdown, that when we're dealing with individuals with sensory processing issues, autism, ADHD, more and more we are starting to understand that mental health or neurological conditions a person doesn't necessarily have full control over. And that's a hard concept, but for many of you who are listening and watching, you may have at some point experienced, extreme sadness in your life, and you couldn't just choose to be happy. You couldn't just make yourself happy just by clicking your fingers. It may have been a process of things to do to get you to that point, but you just couldn't. Or for anybody out there who's got a fear or a phobia of something like spiders, I had a situation with my staff earlier where one of my staff members had a meltdown because she said there's a spider and refused to go near it. It turned out to be a bit of fluff. So rationally, and even when she knew it was a bit of fluff, she still couldn't just settle herself down. She still couldn't, she was still on edge, because even though rationally she knew this isn't the right thing, she couldn't stop her body or emotions kind of all reacting viscerally to emotionally to that kind of stimulus. Okay. So even she in that moment didn't have full control. So we're better and better at understanding that we don't have full control, particularly over emotions in the same way, or sometimes it can't just be a click of the switch to change that emotion. But there is still this difference in opinion that, when a child behaves in a way that may be maladaptive, or an adult as well, or, somebody with dementia who becomes distressed, or an adult with learning disability who's struggling to communicate and goes into this emotive state, they may not have had any other choice, not because maybe because there was a lack of other choices available, or don't have the relevant skills or abilities to make those other choices, not that they just chose not to make another choice. So I often, and some of you may have heard in other podcasts, I referred to the analogy of epilepsy. There was once upon a time we used to feel that people chose to have a seizure. They choose to engage in this seizure behavior because they're in league with Satan or they're demonic possession or whatever it is. They're chosen to do it. And that's why once upon a time individuals were punished for having epilepsy. They were punished for having seizures. They were exorcised or had to go through horrific experiences to try and exorcise the demons. Now we understand what epilepsy is. We wouldn't think in a million years about punishing for somebody having a seizure. Now, that doesn't mean we just let them have seizures. It means we maybe look at what seems to trigger seizures. So if they're photosensitive, maybe we need to kind of reduce the risk for this particular person, okay? As far as let's eliminate flashing lights. If we know that when they're tired or they're anxious, they're more likely to have a seizure, then maybe we need to help them to recognize when they're tired or anxious, make reasonable adjustments of what they could do, where they could go, how they can better manage their anxiety, or how they can get the rest that they need. If they did have a seizure, we just make sure that they and others were safe. Then afterwards, we just let them know they're still accepted. They're still empathized with. They're still, hey, we'll figure this out together. There would be no judgment, shaming, blaming. Okay, but I find this so frustrating that we're still so far behind mental and neurological health in the way that we are with physical health. Okay, if somebody has an allergic reaction to something, we don't consider them to be oversensitive in comparison to that child or that adult who is struggling to cope with a stressful day. We just go, well, that individual's more sensitive to that than we are. And yeah, that analogy works forward to coping with stress and difficult and resilience and stuff like that. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know that one answer is definitely not, is to continue to use language like kicked off. So did they kick off on purpose, or Were they struggling emotionally? Was it and there's controversy around the term meltdown as well, but as far as, was it an emotional dysregulated state? They were struggling to cope for whatever reasons in that moment. The second brand to have is labeling as far as terms like lazy, difficult, stubborn, and stuff like that, where labels are used about a person to define them. I could probably do a whole nother podcast or a whole nother episode or a short episode just exploring this. So I might do that. As far as but things like when you hear somebody referring to somebody as a liar. Now, I guarantee you, anybody who has lied, and no matter what the context and circumstances of when or where they have lied, there will also be times and circumstances and situations where they have also told the truth. Now, when we hear them tell a lie or we find out that they told a lie, we then call them a liar. We don't just say they lied in that circumstance. We don't just say they engaged in lying behavior. We then kind of go, they are a liar. Okay, so we label across that one behavior to them as a personality again. But it's very rare that if a person's ever told a truth, that we'd ever call them a truther. I don't think I've ever heard somebody refer to somebody as a truther. There does seem to be this focus on negative attributes, that if you don't engage in something or don't interact with something, then that must mean you're lazy. If you don't comply with what I want you to do, that must mean that you're stubborn. If you tell a mistruth or you tell a story, from my perspective, you are now a liar. And I say you can't be a liar and a truther at the same time, but I guarantee any person has said both. For any person we perceive as lazy, there will be points in their life they've worked very hard and they've been dedicated, but we would label them as being a hard worker in that circumstance. It's what we see as a negative kind of is dominant. The big thing with that, I also think it doesn't do us any benefits from labeling those behaviors as well. I think the more we do these things to others, the more that we unconsciously do them to ourselves as well, where we hold ourselves to our scripts. That I must not be lazy by taking a break, which means that I must be a workaholic to be considered okay and to be accepted in this world. I know that's a specific one that I felt very guilty of at times, based on scripts I have in my head. For those of you listening, maybe you aren't aware of what script is, but scripts are the kind of narratives we get from our caregivers, our role models, and they continue to develop through our life, but where it tells us what we should and shouldn't do, how we should and shouldn't be, what is a good and good not, made up new phrases there, good and not good life. And therefore, these scripts sometimes affect us emotionally when we don't feel that we are falling in line with one of these scripts. But one of the things I always try and get over in the work I do, that just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. Just because you think you should be perfect doesn't mean it's true. Just because you think you should be hardworking doesn't mean it's true at all times in all circumstances. And that's the same thing. We often pass these scripts off that we hold it to ourselves. We then hold them to other people as well. You should be hardworking. You should do this. You shouldn't do that. And that leads to, it leads to an awful lot of conflict. For any couple listening to this, or a person in a couple, for instance, there will be times when you go, you're thinking about your partner, you should or shouldn't do this. And that's not how they live. That's not their values. That's not their script. And therefore you end up having a disagreement as a result of that. You can like them to do that, but it's not that they should. The last one that I just want to refer to as a term that has fallen out of favor anyway, to be fair. And in things like tact guidelines, they kind of recommend not using this terminology. But the term attention seeking, again, specific around behavior, whether it be buzzer pressing in elderly care, whether it be excessive noise making or verbalizing within adult learning disabilities, or whether it be a child engaging in some level of disruptive behavior in a classroom, and the instinct is they're just attention seeking. The reason that I don't like this particular term is because there seems to be an old logic thinking around that term attention seeking, that there is something wrong with wanting attention. I think attention is a normal part of human requirements. In fact, Maslow's hierarchy says, the basic needs, but attention, attachment, and connection are right up there. And we all display sometimes inappropriate ways of gaining the attention that we feel we need or deserve. If you come from work and usual interaction with the person you live with is, hey, I'm home, and they come down and have a chat with you and they see how you're doing and you sit and have a drink together and catch up on your day. That's your usual interaction. But on this day, you shout up the stairs, hey, I'm home, and they just kind of go, all right, and they don't come downstairs. They just seem to ignore you. Now, some of you will go upstairs and check that they're okay and see how their day's doing and see if everything's all right, as this isn't typical behavior. Others or other days, we might just shout upstairs, fine, put the kettle on myself, shall I? Or I'll get started on tea then, shall I? And we then create this confrontation because that bad attention is better than no attention at all. So you still managed to meet your need. It was a need in a different way, or it was met in a different way, but it's still a case of that attention was met. So the current recommendations, as far as that language is concerned, is that rather than thinking of it attention seeking, we change it to connection seeking or attachment needing or attachment seeking or whatever it is. If we take it down to, well, we all want connections, we all need attachment, they're basic human requirements. But then if a person is behaving in a way that we think is they're just doing it for attention, and our instinct is then to ignore them because they need to learn. Instead we went, okay, well, imagine we had an individual who was starving and they just kept going, please, can I have some food? I don't think many of us would be callous enough or cold enough to go, just ignore them. They're just starving. Hopefully we just want to help them find a way of either finding an appropriate way of getting that food or provide that food for them. Either way, whether we're meeting the need for them or teaching them to be able to do it themselves. Okay. And that should be exactly the same premise and idea around attention or attachment or connection. That rather than going ignore them, we should be going either do we need to give it to them, or do we need to teach them the appropriate ways of gaining it, or being resilient enough to cope without it for short periods of time, knowing that they're going to get it in the future. Like if I'm hungry now, I might be able to wait for an hour as long as I know that I've got a dinner coming later. Okay, so hopefully following that analogy on, be useful for how many of you are dealing with the buzzer pressing. Okay, well, if you find the buzzer pressing annoying, then how can you help them to meet that need of needing human connection, needing attachment, needing attention in a way that you find positive, or help them to know that it's coming if they could just wait a little bit longer. Hopefully you found this episode useful, and I'd love your comments and thoughts around those three phrases. So kicked off, attention seeking, and then labeling like lazy, difficult, stubborn. What are your thoughts on those? Do you hear those phrases thrown around? Do you hear people saying them? Have you ever thought about them? Are you guilty of them using yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just comment, like, subscribe, and share if this was of interest. Thanks very much.